In the high granite reaches of the Sierra Nevada, an engineer's greatest enemy was not the weight of the steel behind him, but the very air entering his lungs. By the early 1900s, the mountain passes of Northern California had become a claustrophobic gauntlet where heat and invisible gases turned iron cabs into suffocating chambers. To survive the climb, a man had to learn exactly how many seconds of consciousness he had left before the mountain took his breath for good. The Sierra Nevada was once known as the deadliest stretch of railroad in America, a title earned not through spectacular collisions, but through a slow, grinding war of attrition against the human body. As the Southern Pacific locomotive struggled upward toward the clouds, the environment inside the cab transformed. It was a place of extremes that few modern travelers could imagine. Temperatures frequently exceeded 130 or 140 degrees Fahrenheit, a heat so intense that the metal handles of the controls became painful to touch. But the heat was merely a distraction. The true threat was the air itself, a thick, suffocating mixture of soot and invisible carbon monoxide that pooled in the low-lying sections of the tunnels. For the men operating these giants, survival became a matter of grim mathematics. Engineers learned to count the tunnels and the timber snowsheds with a haunting precision. They knew exactly which stretches of the line allowed for a breath of fresh air and which ones required them to hold their breath until their lungs burned. It was a common sight to see a fireman or an engineer collapse over his controls, his body failing long before the locomotive reached the summit. There are records of trains continuing to climb blindly through the dark, the crew unconscious while the fire continued to roar and the iron wheels continued to turn. This reality raises a central question that haunted the boardrooms of the Southern Pacific for decades. Why did the company continue to accept a design that was clearly killing its most skilled employees? For nearly half a century, the tradition of steam locomotive design dictated that the boiler must lead the way, placing the crew directly behind the smokestack. To change this was to invite mechanical chaos and a total betrayal of engineering orthodoxy. And yet, as the death toll rose, a radical idea began to take root. How did a design once called insane, placing the crew at the very front of the engine with nothing protecting them from a collision, become a life-saving standard? To understand this shift, one must look at the geography of Donner Pass. Rising to an elevation of over 7,000 feet, the pass presented a challenge that broke both machines and men. The grades were relentless, reaching 2.2%, which required locomotives to work at their absolute maximum capacity. To keep the tracks clear of the legendary Sierra snowpack, which could pile up to 30 feet deep in a single season, the railroad constructed nearly 40 miles of tunnels and near-continuous snow sheds. These structures were necessary for the trains to move, but they turned the mountain into a death trap. The snow sheds essentially turned the railroad into a sealed pipe. Built from heavy timber and spanning miles of track, they were designed to shed the weight of avalanches, but they had the unintended side effect of trapping exhaust. There was no wind to clear the air and no ventilation to allow the heat to escape. When a massive steam engine entered a shed, it pushed a wall of hot, toxic gas ahead of it. Because the engine was working so hard to fight the grade, the exhaust was released with incredible force, hitting the ceiling of the shed and rolling back down into the cab. The invisible killer in these sheds was carbon monoxide. It was odorless, colorless, and utterly relentless. Because the fireman was physically exerting himself, shoveling tons of fuel to maintain steam pressure, he was usually the first to succumb. His heart rate would climb, his breathing would deepen, and he would begin to inhale the poison at a faster rate than the engineer. It was a routine occurrence for an engineer to look across the cab and find his partner slumped in the coal pile. Soon after, the engineer would feel the same dizzying fog descend. In several harrowing instances, trains kept moving because the throttle was stuck open or the crew's hands had locked onto the controls in a final, involuntary spasm. Historians who study the expansion of the American West, such as those who examine the records of the Southern Pacific, note that these were not rare accidents. They were the daily reality of the job. Crews began treating fainting and respiratory distress as mere occupational hazards, a price to be paid for the privilege of working the mountain. But as the engines grew larger and the tonnage of the trains increased, the volume of smoke grew as well, pushing the human body beyond its breaking point. The first attempts to solve the problem were born of desperation rather than engineering genius. The company issued respirators to the crews, simple devices made of cotton and felt. The instructions were to soak these masks in water before entering the long stretches of snow sheds. The theory was that the wet fabric would filter out the soot and cool the air. However, the reality inside the tunnels was far different. Within just a few minutes, the heavy soot from the engines would mix with the water on the masks, turning the filters into a thick, impenetrable layer of mud. Instead of helping the men breathe, the masks increased breathing resistance, causing the crews to pass out even faster than before. When the respirators failed, the focus shifted toward mechanical fixes on the locomotives themselves. Engineers experimented with smoke deflectors, large metal hoods, plates, and angled exhaust stacks designed to direct the smoke away from the cab. On open tracks, these devices worked reasonably well, but inside the narrow confines of a snowshed, they were a disaster. The deflectors would catch the smoke and swirl it around the front of the engine, often blowing it directly onto the cab windows. This created a new and terrifying problem. The engineers lost all sight of the signals and the tracks ahead. In an environment where a single mistake could lead to a derailment or a collision, emergency braking in near-zero visibility became a common and heart-pounding necessity. As the physical solutions failed, the railroad turned to operating rules as a last resort. These were the band-aids of the era. The company attempted to stagger the timing of trains to allow the smoke in the sheds to settle, but the high volume of traffic made this nearly impossible. Crews were encouraged to open cab doors to create a cross breeze, but this only invited more heat and gas into their workspace. Some men began bringing their own survival kits to work. Buckets of water and heavy rags to wrap around their faces, or even small oxygen tanks when they became available. These rituals were not solutions, they were symptoms of a system in crisis. The men of the Southern Pacific were being asked to perform a high-stakes job in an environment that was fundamentally incompatible with human life. Hospitalizations for respiratory damage and heat exhaustion continued to rise, and a sense of quiet resentment began to build among the crews. They were operating some of the most powerful machines in the world, yet they were being suffocated by the very power they commanded. The pressure of the Sierra Nevada was not just a physical weight, it was an emotional one. Every time a crew began the climb from Roseville or Sparks, they knew they were entering a combat zone. The beauty of the high mountains was obscured by the soot on their goggles and the burning in their throats. They moved through a landscape of majestic peaks and deep canyons, but their world was narrowed down to the flickering light of the firebox and the oppressive darkness of the sheds. Scholars like Richard Steinheimer have often reflected on the unique stoicism of these mountain crews. They were a breed of men who accepted the hazards of the job because they took immense pride in moving the mountain. But even the most stoic men have a limit. By the turn of the century, that limit had been reached. The mechanical limits of the traditional steam engine had finally collided with the biological limits of the human lung. Something had to change, even if it meant breaking every rule that the railroad industry held sacred. The tension on the line was mirrored by the tension in the company's offices. Reports of near misses and incapacitated crews were piling up on the desks of supervisors. The Southern Pacific was a massive corporation built on efficiency and tradition. But it was realizing that dead or injured engineers were a profound threat to the bottom line. The staggering of trains and the use of wet rags had reached their natural conclusion. There was no more room for compromise. The mountain was demanding a total rethink of how a locomotive should be built, and the answer would require a level of courage that went beyond simple mechanics. As the decade drew to a close, the stage was set for a confrontation between the old guard of engineering and a new, desperate necessity. The tradition of the boiler-first locomotive was about to be challenged by the simple, human need to breathe. The solution would not come from a minor adjustment or a new rulebook, but from a total inversion of reality, a betrayal of tradition that would eventually save countless lives and redefine the silhouette of the American West. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the mounting pressure of the Sierra began to filter into the quiet, mahogany-paneled boardrooms of the Southern Pacific. By 1908, the crisis on Donner Pass had reached a deadlock that could no longer be ignored by the company's upper management. Incident reports were no longer just statistics, they were becoming a heavy weight on the conscience and the operational capacity of the entire railroad. Trains were being delayed, and more importantly, the relationship between the men on the mountain and the leadership in the city was fraying to the point of collapse. Records from this period indicate a growing sense of unrest among the locomotive crews. In the railroad towns of Roseville and Sparks, a quiet but firm resistance was forming. Some of the most experienced engineers, men who had spent decades mastering the nuances of steam and steel, began to refuse assignments that took them over the summit. It was a terrifying prospect for the company, a specialized workforce essentially engaging in an undeclared strike, driven not by a desire for higher wages, but by the simple, primal fear of not coming home. They were tired of the sealed pipe of the snow sheds and the constant threat of a silent death in the cab. The boardrooms of the Southern Pacific were filled with tension. On one side stood the traditionalists who believed that the existing steam locomotive design was the pinnacle of engineering. To them, the boiler was the heart and the shield of the engine, and any deviation from this layout was seen as a dangerous gamble. On the other side were those who realized that the current path was unsustainable. The company was facing a crossroads where human survival had to finally outweigh the rigid traditions of the Victorian era. It was into this atmosphere of deadlock that William Hood, the chief engineer of the Southern Pacific, stepped forward with a proposal that many of his peers considered forbidden. Hood was a man who understood the Sierra Nevada better than perhaps anyone else in the company. He had spent years studying the grades, the weather patterns, and the limitations of the machinery. His idea was deceptively simple but structurally revolutionary. If the exhaust and the heat were the problems, why not simply turn the locomotive around? He proposed putting the cab at the very front of the engine, ahead of the smokestack and the boiler. The objections were immediate and fierce. In the world of 1908, a steam locomotive was a weapon of momentum. The massive boiler was considered a necessary buffer for the crew in the event of a collision. Putting the men at the very front, with nothing but a thin sheet of glass and steel between them and the tracks, was seen by many as a death sentence in its own right. One major accident, the critics argued, would end the company's reputation and the cab-forward experiment forever. They feared that by solving the problem of the air, they were creating a far more violent problem of safety. However, the voices from the mountain were becoming impossible to drown out. Petitions began to circulate among the engineers, signed by hundreds of men who worked the Donner Pass line. These documents were not filled with complex legal language or demands for luxury. Instead, they carried a single, repeated plea that resonated through the corridors of power. We want to breathe. It was a human cry for a basic necessity, and for the first time in the history of the railroad, it became the primary driver of mechanical innovation. The Southern Pacific leadership finally realized that the risk of a collision was a theoretical fear, while the risk of suffocation was a daily certainty. The challenge was then handed to the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, the legendary manufacturers of American steam power. The engineering problems Baldwin faced were immense, and at times they seemed impossible to resolve. The most critical factor was the fuel. A traditional coal-burning engine could never be a cab forward because the firemen would still need to be near the tender to shovel fuel into the firebox. This meant that the new design had to be oil-fired, a technology that was still maturing. In a cab-forward design, the fuel oil had to be piped from the tender at the rear, past the entire length of the massive boiler, and into the firebox at the front. This created a mechanical nightmare. The fuel pipes had to run nearly 100 feet along the frame of the locomotive. Because these were articulated engines, meaning they were built with a hinge in the middle to allow them to navigate the sharp curves of the mountains, the pipes required flexible joints. In the early 20th century, these joints were notorious for leaking. Every joint was a potential explosion waiting to happen, a vulnerability that kept the shop crews in a state of constant anxiety. The first of these new engines, designated as the MC2 class, were massive, articulated mallets. They were over 100 feet long and weighed hundreds of thousands of pounds. When the first units arrived in the Sierra, the atmosphere was one of cautious skepticism. Shop crews were ordered to inspect every single joint and pipe after every run. The pressure on the engineering teams was not just mechanical, it was deeply political. They knew that the eyes of the entire industry were on them, waiting to see if this strange, reversed giant would be the savior of the line or its greatest failure. As the first MC2 was prepared for its inaugural run over the mountain, the crew felt a mixture of trepidation and hope. For the first time, they climbed into a cab that looked out over the tracks with nothing in front of them but the horizon. Behind them sat the massive boiler, and behind that, the smokestack that had once been their greatest tormentor. The psychological shift was as profound as the mechanical one. Historians such as Ezra Vogel have often noted how industrial shifts are frequently dictated by moments of extreme pressure where old systems can no longer support the human element. This was exactly what was happening on the Southern Pacific. The cab forward was a physical manifestation of a company finally acknowledging the limits of its workers. The first mountain run was a revelation. As the locomotive entered the first of the long tunnels, the crew braced themselves for the familiar wave of heat and the acrid smell of burning oil and coal. But it never came. Because the cab was at the very front, it entered the tunnel while the air was still clear and cool. The exhaust from the smokestack was released far behind them, drifting into the tunnel walls and snow sheds long after the crew had passed. For the first time in their careers, the men stopped counting the seconds between tunnels. They could see the signals clearly, and they could breathe without the aid of wet rags or failing respirators. One engineer on that first run reportedly remarked that for the first time, the mountain didn't take something back. The physical toll of the journey had been replaced by a sense of clarity and control. The visibility was beyond anything they had ever experienced. Without the long boiler blocking their view, they could see the track curving ahead of them with perfect precision, a luxury that significantly reduced the stress of the high-altitude climb. The proof of success was immediate and undeniable. Within months of the MC2's introduction, the statistics began to tell a new story. Carbon monoxide poisonings among the crews nearly disappeared. The reports of firemen collapsing in the coal pile became relics of the past. Furthermore, major accidents on the mountain dropped sharply. Because the engineers could see the signals and the condition of the track so much more clearly, they were able to react to hazards long before they became disasters. The fear that the cab-forward design would lead to more collision deaths proved to be unfounded. In fact, the increased visibility made the entire operation safer. Contemporary observers noted that the spirit of the railroad changed almost overnight. The grim, survivalist atmosphere of the Donner Pass run was replaced by a new sense of professional pride. The Southern Pacific had bet on a radical design, and that bet had paid off in the most meaningful way possible, by protecting the lives of its people. The tradition of the boiler-forward locomotive had been betrayed, but in that betrayal, the railroad had found its future. The success of the MC2 class paved the way for more advanced versions, eventually leading to the legendary AC series of locomotives. These were the true kings of the Sierra, refined and perfected over the next several decades. They became the backbone of the mountain service, proving that when engineering focuses on the human being at the center of the machine, it can overcome even the most hostile environments on Earth. The insane idea of 1908 had become the gold standard of the 1920s and 30s, a testament to the fact that progress sometimes requires looking at the world from a completely different direction. As the months unfold into years, the radical experiment of the cab-forward design transforms from a desperate survival tactic into the definitive symbol of Western railroading. What began as a scattered handful of prototypes evolves into a fleet of 256 locomotives, forming the backbone of mountain operations for the Southern Pacific. These machines are no longer seen as mechanical oddities or dangerous departures from tradition. They are recognized as the only practical way to conquer the Sierra Nevada. The cab forward becomes more than a tool. It becomes a legendary figure in the landscape, a massive, articulated guardian that allows the commerce of a nation to flow through the clouds without demanding the lives of the men who move it. By the 1930s and 40s, the evolution of the design reaches its peak with the introduction of the AC series, specifically the AC-10, 11, and the final 12. These are behemoths of steel weighing over 1 million pounds when fully loaded with fuel and water. They stand as a testament to how far engineering can go when it is freed from the constraints of outdated thinking. On the steep 2.2% grades leading up to the summit of Donner Pass, these engines demonstrate a level of reliability and power that defines an era. They are capable of hauling massive freight loads through the very snow sheds that once functioned as gas chambers, but now those sheds are merely tunnels to be navigated with confidence. The culture of the railroad changes along with the machinery. In the early days of the century, a mountain assignment was often viewed with a sense of dread, but by the height of the cab-forward era, these runs are highly coveted. Engineers and firemen actively request cab-forward assignments knowing that they will be working in an environment that respects their physical needs. The interior of the cab is spacious, and most importantly, clear of the suffocating exhaust that plagued their predecessors. For the veteran railroader, the sight of the open track ahead, unobscured by 100 feet of boiler, is a luxury that never grows old. It represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between man and machine, where the machine is finally designed to accommodate the human rather than the other way around. Historian Ezra Vogel, who has often written on the organizational triumphs of industrial giants, might see this transition as a classic example of calculated innovation. The Southern Pacific did not change because it was easy. They changed because the environmental pressures of the Sierra Nevada made the old way of doing things impossible. The fleet of 256 engines represents a massive capital investment, a signal to the world that the company values operational safety as a primary component of efficiency. Throughout the heavy traffic of World War II, these engines proved their worth 10 times over, moving millions of tons of military hardware and thousands of troops across the mountains with a precision that would have been impossible 30 years earlier. But even as the cab forward reaches its zenith, the shadows of change are already beginning to lengthen across the tracks. The arrival of the diesel-electric locomotive brings a new set of rules to the mountains. Unlike the steam engine, the diesel does not rely on a massive firebox or a boiler that produces clouds of toxic smoke. The diesel units are modular, easier to maintain, and significantly cheaper to operate over long distances. They do not require the massive infrastructure of water towers and fuel depots that the steam giants demand. Most importantly, the diesel inherently solves the problem that the cab forward was designed to address. It offers a clear view of the track and a smoke-free environment for the crew without needing a revolutionary layout. By the mid-1950s, the transition is swift and unsympathetic. The very efficiency that the cab forward brought to the Sierra is now being surpassed by a new technology that doesn't require the romantic complexity of steam. The diesel units can be linked together to provide even more power than a single AC-12, and they can do so with a fraction of the maintenance crew. In 1956, the era of regular steam service on the Southern Pacific effectively comes to an end. The great, articulated giants that once ruled the summit are suddenly redundant. They are pulled from service not because they failed, but because they have completed their mission so successfully that they paved the way for their own replacements. The disappearance of the cab-forward fleet is rapid, and for many who love the machines, heartbreaking. Throughout the late 1950s, these magnificent engines are lined up in scrapyards, their steel frames cut apart by the same torches that once helped build them. For a machine that was built to protect lives, its end seems remarkably cold. Thousands of tons of specialized engineering are melted down to be reused in other industries, leaving behind only memories and the silent, empty snow sheds of the High Sierra. The era of big steam in the West vanishes almost as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the mountains to the hum of the diesel engines and the whistle of the wind through the pines. Amidst the destruction, however, one survivor is pulled back from the brink. The AC-12 No. 4294, the very last steam locomotive ordered by the Southern Pacific, is spared from the scrapper's torch. It is preserved not merely because of its size or its aesthetic beauty, though it is undeniably impressive, but because of what it represents. It stands today as a monument to a specific moment in history, when a corporation was forced to prioritize the breadth of its workers over the traditions of its industry. It remains a physical anchor to a time when men had to outthink a mountain that was trying to kill them. Today, visitors to the California State Railroad Museum can stand beneath the massive pilot of the 4294 and look up into the cab that changed everything. It is a humbling experience to realize that this design was once considered a radical, almost frightening departure from the norm. The locomotive serves as a reminder that progress is not always a straight line forward. Sometimes it requires a complete reversal of perspective. The cab forward was a correct solution to a lethal problem, a mechanical testament to the fact that when we ignore tradition in favor of human safety, we create things that are truly remarkable. As we look back on the history of Donner Pass and the men who worked the high iron, we see a story of endurance and ingenuity. The Sierra Nevada remains as majestic and formidable as ever, but it no longer holds the same terrors for the people who cross it. The invisible killers of the tunnels have been vanquished by a combination of better technology and the courage to change. The cab-forward locomotives may no longer roar through the snow sheds, but their legacy lives on in the very idea that a workplace should be survivable, and that an engineer should always be able to see the tracks ahead. Sometimes engineering must defy instinct to achieve its highest purpose. It is a lesson that extends far beyond the realm of railroads and steam engines. It reminds us that when we face a problem that seems insurmountable, the answer may not lie in working harder, but in looking at the situation from a completely different angle. The Southern Pacific's reversed giants proved that even the most deeply ingrained traditions can be discarded when they no longer serve the people they were meant to support. The mountain will always be there, indifferent to the machines that climb its flanks. But because of the cab forward, the men who move the world across those peaks can do so with their heads held high and their lungs full of clear mountain air. It is a story of triumph, not over nature, but over the limitations of our own imagination. It is a reminder that the most important part of any machine is the human heart that beats within it. Progress doesn't always move forward in a straight line. Sometimes it survives by turning around, facing the wind, and finding a new way to breathe. There is a quiet dignity in the story of the cab forward that resonates with us even today. It isn't just a story about gears, pistons, or the thermodynamics of steam. It is a story about the sanctity of human life in the face of industrial necessity. For the older generations who remember the tail end of the steam era, or those who simply appreciate the weight of history, these locomotives represent a rare moment where a massive organization paused to listen to the people on the front lines. They remind us of a time when the solution to a problem wasn't found in a computer chip, but in the grit and determination of engineers who were willing to risk their reputations to save their colleagues. As we reflect on the legacy of number 4294 and the two M55 sisters that didn't survive, we are reminded that every piece of technology we take for granted today was once a hard-won victory. The safety and comfort of modern travel were paid for by the coal dust and carbon monoxide of the past. It is a gentle, humbling thought to realize that the air we breathe so easily today was once a luxury fought for by men in the dark of a Sierra tunnel. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.